So while Caro is getting ready, I will say a few words. So Caro Williams-Pierce is a new assistant professor in the College of Information Studies here at the University of Maryland. Previously, she was an assistant professor at SUNY Albany, and we were very happy to get her this last year and invite her as a member of the HCIL. And she will, in general, works in games and learning, and I'll let her talk about this in more detail.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. And I noticed there were a few questions that there wasn't time to get to, but just a reminder that Nicholas's student will be presenting more about this, and she would be happy to answer those questions in the Q&A session. So I'm Caro Williams-Pierce. I think Nicholas already mentioned this, but I just finished my first year here at the UMDI school, and I'm really, really excited to be here at the 37th HCIL symposium. This symposium is almost as old as I am, and that is incredible. I am just like blown away by you all. Okay, so to get to my work though, my research focuses on games and learning. That is not the same as games for learning, but games and learning. In particular, how do games use learning to teach players how to play? And this is often mistaken for games for learning, probably because my background is primarily in mathematics education. So I often look at how math shows up in games and gameplay. But I and many others have talked about games and learning that don't have anything to do with what's considered formal educational content. And if you go to my Medium blog post, you'll see some of my favorite resources there about games and learning and failure and feedback. And today I'm specifically going to focus on feedback and failure in video games. And I don't believe math comes up much at all. So if you dislike math, it's okay. You're safe to stay here and listen to me talk. I gave this the subtitle also known as Why You Should Sometimes Set Players on Fire, because in my game design, I actually really enjoy setting players on fire. I guess it's a personal quirk, but I'm going to cover a variety of different ways in which feedback and failure can show up in video games that don't all involve fire, I promise. So, games, like life, require learning. Otherwise, how would I go from being myself, I'm a portly middle-aged academic, to being Lara Croft or Solid Snake or this adorable Raggedy Hat Professor Wizard in Animal Crossing New Horizons? And yes, this is my avatar, and yes, she is beautiful. So the design of each of those games includes these specific opportunities for learning what it means to be Lara Croft or Solid Snake or this Professor Wizard. And so we learn in these games, just as we learn in this physical, social, cultural world around us, by having these expectations that are violated in the moment. So if we do an action, we get a response. And we often expect a specific response, but learning happens when we expect a specific response, and instead, Lara Croft falls down the cliff. Solid Snake gets detected by a guard, or I get stung by wasps. And here's the thing, in all well-designed games, these moments of failure come with carefully paired feedback. And that feedback tells us what we need to learn and how we need to learn it. So I'm going to give you an example of failure and feedback from my game that does involve fiery death. This game is Rolly's Adventure. I built it on the Little Big Planet platform back in 2015, I think. And I fuzzed out the player's face here just so the videos of this talk don't violate IRB permissions.
What? What the heck?
So, failure is not an inherently unpleasant experience. That fiery death is actually pretty adorable and pretty hilarious, and the player definitely knows that he's failed, but he seems a little unsure of why. And here's why. So in this picture, you can see on the right, there's a lot of fire, and then there's this golden block right in the middle of it that's not on fire. That golden block actually represents the feedback in Rolly's Adventure, once the player learns to see it. And it's almost the only thing on the screen that's not on fire, so it stands out. It's visually yelling, pay attention to me. So fiery death in Rolly's Adventure is the primary indicator of failure. And but this action, failure plus feedback, works pretty well even if you're not going for a fiery death. And failure is a key part of good game design or any sort of HCI design. And this is because of what Brousseau terms the didactical contract, which is about trust and learning. And I've adapted Brousseau's didactical contract to games, so I'm just calling it the design contract. And Brousseau was focused on this math learning in classrooms, but my adaptation brings his work more clearly into our world. So I'm going to give you a little excerpt of Brousseau. It's going to be a wall of text. I will read it out loud. I apologize, but it's really a nice wall of text. So, adapting to games or HCI more broadly, the teacher must design tasks in such a way that the student can solve the situation of action using only prior knowledge and the information provided by the task. The teacher, in adhering to the didactical contract, essentially promises the student that the task in front of them is achievable. The student knows that the task was designed to elicit some new form of knowledge, but she must also know that this knowledge is entirely justified by the internal logic of the situation, and that she can construct it without appealing to didactical reasoning, such as asking the teacher for the algorithm. So here's the adaptation to the design contract. The designer must design games in such a way that the player can solve the situation of action using only prior knowledge and the information provided by the game. The designer, in adhering to the design contract, essentially promises the player that the game in front of them is achievable. The player knows that the game was designed to elicit some new form of action or knowledge, but she must also know that this action or knowledge is entirely justified by the internal logic of the game, and that she can play it without appealing to resources outside of the game. In other words, when you design and ship a product, you promise that it's usable, that the users can trust you and your design to support learning how to use it. This means that feedback is this needed component, because otherwise players will fail for no apparent reason, and your design becomes this unpredictable, unreliable design that no one wants to play or use. And the game design world has had experience with this. So Nintendo's prominence today is due specifically to the fact that other companies violated the design contract back in the 1980s. There's a few different articles about this, but Nintendo's seal of approval was their way of saying, we promise that the design contract is one that we hold dear. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of failure and feedback that are in games that adhere to this design contract. I'm going to give you two different examples that I encountered in the wild that riff off of my Setting Players on Fire title, before moving on to a different example that doesn't involve fire. So, excuse me. This is an example from students enrolled in Alex Leach's interaction design class this spring. It's this physical puzzle game, and the goal is to get from one point to another without getting hit by light. So the boxes and the trees provide this shade from the flashlights, or not, as in this case with our playtester Haley. So here you can see Haley's knees are being hit by this flashlight, and everybody in this picture is smiling, including Haley, even though she is failing because she's being hit by the light. So if this were a digital game, she would be on fire. I should also say many thanks to the students who agreed to let me share their work right there. My next example is, this is not game related, so it's a little closer to the HCI world, I think. So my husband is a designer and a programmer, and was designing a teacher portal for one of his software projects. And one of the things with a teacher portal is that a teacher needs to be able to create, modify, and delete student records. And of course, the teacher needs to get feedback that they're successful in creating or modifying or deleting that record. Unfortunately, when deleting a record, the default feedback shown to the teacher was, student was successfully destroyed, which made me laugh hysterically, and made him change it so that it was less like fiery death and said something more like, student record was successfully destroyed. Now, here we go. Oh wait, I have to give you a quick warning. So not all feedback and failure are created equally. So I have to spend at least 10 seconds warning you about this. Sometimes failure is designed to trick you. This example is from Candy Crush, and it's designed specifically to violate the design contract. So you have to reach out to outside resources in a way that will ultimately benefit the game designers, not you as a player, and not necessarily you within this world that is Candy Crush. I could have just as easily put up Plants vs. Zombies 2, which I'm still bitter about, because I loved PVZ1, but PVZ2 just said, screw the design contract. Let's hand out this broken experience, and we'll nickel and dime players throughout the entire trajectory just to make it a less broken experience. So yeah, I could give a plenary on PVZ2 and my disappointment. All right, so there's your warning. Failure and feedback can be used for ill. But now we're going to talk about failure and feedback being used to perpetuate a certain experience. And in most of the examples I've given before, there's pretty obvious indicators of failure and feedback, but there's also these like quiet or sneaky ones that background this feeling of failure. So I've written about micro failures, which is when the failure barely feels like failure at all to the player. Then there's failure that's secret to the player because there's nothing in the game that indicates failure. Or there's failure that takes days to become evident. There's delayed feedback. Or there's failure that provokes irritation and makes the player go seek feedback. So I'm going to illustrate a couple of these types of failure. And there's other ones in the blog post that accompanies this. And to illustrate these, I'm going to use my new favorite adorable game, which is Animal Crossing New Horizons. I love this game. Okay. So I'm going to assume that most people here are familiar enough with the idea of puttering around a deserted island, which is pretty much what Animal Crossing is. So you don't have to be familiar with Animal Crossing. You just have to be familiar with the idea of a lazy, deserted island that you happen to be on. That's also adorable. And I'm going to talk, and yeah, I highly recommend that if you don't do yoga, you should go buy this game because it's the social emotional equivalent of it for me. All right, so microfailures. A microfailure is when a player tries to do something and fails, but they barely feel like failing. And an outside observer often can't even tell that they failed. So I wrote about experiencing microfailure originally in GeoGebra, which is a mathematics simulator. And this is what I wrote. If anyone were watching me, they would not see evidence of failure in my interactions. Without knowing my immediate goal for each slight adjustment, and without knowing what I expected to occur before my interactions, the viewer has no way of seeing that I failed to receive the feedback I expected. So what might this look like in Animal Crossing? So here's me with my trusty shovel. And I would like to dig a hole to plant even more flowers because you can apparently never have too many flowers. So I have dug this hole, and it's a perfectly good hole for me to plant flowers in. But maybe I don't want it right there. I wanted it right here instead. So this is actually a micro failure. My internal goal of putting the hole in the right spot is violated. But then I just close this hole up, dig the next hole, plant the flower, move on to my day. I barely experience failure. And an outside observer, if you didn't have access to my internal intentions of digging the hole right next to it, then you would assume that maybe I just changed my mind. It probably would not even appear to be failure to you. And without asking me what I had intended when I first hit the dig hole button, you would have no access to the fact that any sort of failure actually occurred. Okay, I'm going to take a quick sip of water. You're probably going to hear slurping. I apologize. All right. So microfailures are this huge and important part of Animal Crossing, and I believe most good games actually, but they're micro. They don't take a ton of time to explain, or they take 12 hours to explain. And I'm just going to stick with the micro. I give you a specific example, and I'm happy to talk more about it in Q&A. But I want to talk about secret failures because this is one of my favorite parts of Animal Crossing. And this is the story of the money tree. So I'm wandering around my island one day, and ta-da, there's this strange gold spike just coming out of the ground. And immediately, of course, I wonder, is there something under the ground there? So I bust out my trusty shovel once again, and I dig up 1,000 bells. So I happily tuck this free money in my pockets, I close up the hole so no one trips on it, and I move on with my day. And I have actually, in that moment, experienced secret failure unbeknownst to me. And if you haven't played this game, you're like, what failure? You got a bunch of free bells. Like, how is that failure? So here's the story of the money tree. Okay, see how that hole in the ground, unlike the one that I showed you earlier when I was burying a flower, that's glowing gold. And that's the game very quietly, sneakily telling me that I can do something different with that hole than most. So this is actually quite similar to in Rolly's Adventure, that golden block. Once the player learns to see it, they know that it is telling them something. So if I bury a bag of bells in this hole, like the one that I just picked up, a little tiny sapling appears. And that sapling will actually grow up to be a money tree. So if anyone tells you money doesn't grow on trees, they've definitely never played Animal Crossing. And I'm sorry, that pun is part of my family heritage. Okay. So let's go back to this. If I close that golden hole, I've secretly failed, I don't even know it. If I plant money in the hole, I get something new that indicates some type of success. But there is actually an additional 3 days that I have to wait between planting the sapling and finally getting the money tree. And Animal Crossing time is the same as our physical world time. So it's literally, there are 3 days in which the tree keeps growing bigger, but I have no idea what's going to happen. So that's 3 days before I get the sort of feedback that is tightly tied to my original action of planting this money tree. And this is weird for a number of reasons. So most feedback is designed to be immediately paired with these game actions, like trying to jump up a cliff as Laura. You either succeed or you fall immediately, or if you're sneaking around the ground, a solid snake, you either make it or get discovered, or getting stung by wasps in this game. So there's a number of reasons that this has to, and there's a number of reasons why this is paired. It actually has a lot to do with how we as humans learn really efficiently, and it involves this immediate direct feedback on our immediate action. But Animal Crossing has a blend of feedback times. And this is why. Does this look like the sort of game where efficiency was the primary design goal? It's really more like this beautiful, leisurely, lazy desert island. There's these occasional moments of direct failure and feedback, but mostly it's relaxing as you play, going to the flow, ambling around. That's the emergent experience that Animal Crossing was designed to evoke. And because there's little immediacy in the design, the failure of the feedback, we can inhabit this world in which efficiency of learning is not a key design feature in any way, because the efficiency of the experience is not important when you're on a desert island. My time is probably running out, but I'm gonna sum this up a little bit by bringing us back to the beginning. So action, failure plus feedback, and this contributes directly to the emergent experience promised by the design contract. So this is actually secret micro failure in Animal Crossing, and often leisurely feedback has to do specifically with creating this emergent experience of actually being on a desert island, not falling down cliffs, no real sense of death, very little fire, etc. Without this secret micro failure, without this often leisurely failure and feedback, you would not experience this leisurely, quiet, deserted island that Animal Crossing was designed to evoke. So yeah, if you want to read more about failure in Animal Crossing in particular, read my Medium article. There's a lot there about wasps, but there are no sea bass. That's pretty much it. Like I said, I'm happy to answer questions. I would love it for people to go read my Medium article as well. I've become kind of obsessed with analyzing Animal Crossing from my pre-existing lens of learning and the kind of experience it evokes. And I also want to say thank you so much to Beth Domingo and Nicholas. You all are incredible. And I believe now I'm here for questions.
Absolutely. So please type your questions, and I think a few are coming while I'm speaking. Let me just say I'm a bit envious that you get to play games as part of your research, and I need to hook myself up with some way to do this.
Okay. So the drawback is that work and play become inextricably combined, and I kind of ruined World of Warcraft for me for a while, because I used to do research with Constance Steinkühler on World of Warcraft. And sometimes it became just work.
Yeah.
Yeah. Pros and cons.
So we have some questions. Let me do a few. We're running a little low on time, so I want to ask a few here.
Sorry.
Let's see. But first of all, let me ask, is there a session, you are chairing a session in the, after the break, where there
Yes.
might be more opportunities to talk to you?
Yes, I'm chairing the learning session afterwards.
Yeah, so please, if you have more questions that we can't cover here, please join Caro's session after the break at 11 a.m. We'll talk about that soon. So here's one question. Does the signed contract hold when failure is compelled and mandatory? When a failure is assigned as a story element outside of player control, does this contract hold when it's mandatory?
Oh, absolutely. Oh my goodness. Okay. So I'm going to restate what I think this question is about, because I think there's actually two different parts of this. There is the part where, like, if I design failure into a game that requires that players experience that failure, they cannot avoid it. Does the design contract still hold? That's one part. And then the other part has to do with how narrative fits into that. Okay, so failure in games, like that video of Rolly's adventure, is just a part of casual learning. And in games, we're in this, like, G called it a psychosocial moratorium. It's like, it's okay to fail. So I talk about failure here, and I talked about how we experience failure in our everyday lives, but it's a very different valence of failure. And mandatory failure in games, like, I'm not actually sure what a game would look like without any type of failure. Yeah, I have a very hard time imagining that, because if you are put into a new world, you don't know what the rules are. You don't know what the narrative background is. You don't know what you're allowed to do and what you're not to do. So you will fail. Sometimes it will be micro failures, like in GeoGebra, and other times there'll be huge failures, right? You'll get set on fire. Now, a narrative can very clearly, like, often narratives will start with failure, like waking up and being like, I thought I died, and there's a cutscene at the beginning of the game that's like you dying. I'm trying to remember which game it was that I played that started with that, but like you die in the first 5 minutes of the game, and then the next part is you waking up. So mandatory failure for the purpose of creating a narrative in which you coming back to life plays a key role. So, okay, so I hope I answered both parts of that question.
I think so. And very quickly, there's questions here about how to measure failure, and also how do you assess the size of failure. And these are tricky questions, but I don't know if you have a quick answer, and then we'll send you off, everyone who wants to ask Caro more in detail, to that session at 11. But any preview of an answer?
Okay, so actually my preview of the answer is going to be check back in like a month on the HCIL Medium blog, and I will be happy to riff on this. You won't be super happy with the answer sometimes, because I take a very player-centered perspective, which means you have to get inside someone's head to measure micro failures. So neuroscience maybe, but probably not. So anyway, but yeah, so that's my preview.
Thank you, Caro. I'm going to hand it over to you to introduce Namal.